Spy Cops Info Podcast, a series on the secret undercover political police who spied on over 1,000 campaign groups since 1968. Hashtag Spy Cops Pod. Episode 18. The Special Demonstration Squad Annual Reports, first batch, 68 to 84. Welcome to Spy Cops Info Podcast. I'm Tom Fowler, and once again I'm joined with
Chris Bryan from the Undercover Research Group.
And we're back again with a delve into some of the evidence that has been revealed from the undercover policing inquiry. This time we're going to be looking at the annual reports from the Special Demonstration Squad. So the Special Demonstration Squad was the first of the units set up in 68. In order to justify their existence, they submitted these series of annual reports. So Chris, do you want to just explain who these reports were aimed at and who was writing them?
So the first one was written in 1969, and the latest one we have that's been published by the inquiry was actually written in 1984. Which covered 1983. The only people that saw the annual reports, as far as we know anyway, are the Metropolitan Police. Slightly confusingly, when the inquiry published the annual reports, they packaged them with letters from the Assistant Chief Constable at the time of the Met to the Home Office, basically asking for funds initially and then asking every year for renewal of funds. But basically these letters are kind of an executive summary of the contents of the report, and in some cases very brief, if you like, very executive, so hardly any detail in them.
It's not like the whole report is going all the way up.
No.
But basically what we've got to be able to see is the thing which no senior decision makers wouldn't have seen.
The report was written by either the chief inspector or the detective inspector who was within the SDS, who was the senior officer in there, and they forwarded them generally to the assistant chief commissioner in crime. So at the time that post was scrapped actually around in the 1980s, but. So that commissioner was in charge of CID, and Special Branch came under CID within the MAT. So yeah, as far as we know, the only people that actually saw the whole report were the Metropolitan Police.
Basically, it's an internal document. Essentially, the main role of the document is to go to the decision makers who are going to continue the funding, and they're not getting to see the whole thing.
When I've been processing all these, taking notes and extracting various bits of information from them, and because the way they were packaged, if you like, by the inquiry, I subconsciously I started to think that in fact the Home Office had seen the whole report, just because that's the way they've been presented to us, and then I realised, well, I kind of knew already, but it's kind of slightly surprising that the Home Office continued to hand over, the cash to fund the unit, when basically the only thing they ever saw was sometimes as short as a 3-paragraph letter, just in terms to clear up the financial stuff. First of all, so they started off being funded around £3,000 a year, and initially, I think in the first year, that money actually came directly from MI5, but then hereafter it came from the Home Office. And I've done some sums. I used one of those inflation calculators.
£3,000 then is worth what now?
50 grand. Now, I'm not entirely clear if that included the wages of all the coppers who were in the unit or not. We thought not, but then I have seen a document which seems to say that did include that. But one of the, I suppose, slightly interesting thing, the money side isn't all that interesting to me. Sure. But when we come to the very last report, that's been published, that we've seen, the amount of money goes up in today's money to £150,000. Right. So it's tripled. The real cost has tripled. So it'd be interesting when they have the hearings in May, which are the senior officers. It'd be interesting if that gets put to them by the lawyers. Why, despite the fact they still have the same number of undercovers, more or less 12. But the costs seem to have tripled.
I always hate those things about look how expensive it all was, but it's not really about that. It's just more a thing of these are their justifications.
Yeah, that's the core of the annual reports, and it's basically the SDS, the senior officer within the Special Demonstration Squad, justifying their existence to the more senior officers in the MAT. But some of that, if you like, the sort of broad justification goes into the Home Office letter. So, for instance, this is actually the first letter written in 1969. This is from the Assistant Chief Constable then, Brodie. And he said, this is one of the other things you notice straight away, is they're always harking back to 1968, and often in the reports, like this was like the year when there was like chaos on the streets and they had to instigate this unit. So even doing that by the following year, because they're saying the past 6 months has seen a lessening of the violence. The protest movement is at present seeking some other catalyst to bring all shades of opinion together. And this is the other a bit of a weird concept that probably only the police have of the protest movement. There's not a thing really called the protest movement, is there?
There's this sort of like pseudo-scientific kind of concept that it's going to kind of coalesce and come in ebbs and flows, and they talk about it as if it's like a storm. Like, no, we're not out of the woods yet. You know, it's full of all these like metaphors about like they're like wrestling this monster of like this force of nature.
And the other thing is that the way they phrase it often seems that the protest movement and protesters are constantly in a search for this cause, as if like, you know, it's something that we're trying to find something wrong to protest about, rather than it being quite apparent that there's all these horrible injustices that need to be, you know, addressed in some way. So it says, the protest movement is at present seeking another catalyst to bring all shades of opinion together, but so far it has been unsuccessful. We do not know, certainly, we do not feel we are out of the woods yet. The pattern of student disorder in the States continues, and we feel that once our protest movement groups find the clarion call they are seeking, they will be in the streets in force once again.
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, like you say, that the fact that they're already like on the back foot a bit. I mean, they sound so on the back foot. It's like, oh yeah, well, the problem's kind of gone, but they'll be back in a minute. Honest. And that's the first one.
I mean, 1968 in London, forgetting about what's happening all around the world, which is like there's loads of shit happening everywhere. I mean, it wasn't, you know, it was like big protests in London, Grosvenor Square, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, it wasn't like, you know, riots every weekend or anything, was it? And yet you see this like, oh, back in 1968, weren't things bad? Those were the good old days when we had loads of heads to crack, you know. I didn't actually say that, but you know what I mean? It's kind of like the tone. And also the whole thing about the potential for something to happen. Say it like that's the same letter, but this one's written in 1972. First of all, it bigs up the SDS. Time and experience has brought increased sophistication and professionalism to these operations, and the potential for violence and public disorder in London in the year ahead fully justifies their continuance. And often they talk about the potential in lots of context.
I don't get the impression that their funding was ever really in doubt. But they're fucking over-egging it, aren't they?
Some of those Home Office the letters from the Assistant Chief Commissioner are so short and brief. You kind of think, oh, they already know they're going to get the cash.
Yeah.
There's not much. Skip forward 24 years, 1983, and a letter from the Home Office. Basically, it says, "Do you mind awfully telling us what you've been up to? I know we've not actually asked you this since 1969." Do you mind actually, you know, telling us something and what you're actually doing? It's more or less that. So, you know, not a great deal of supervision coming from the Home Office there.
That's crazy, isn't it? I mean, they get you like how much of the civil service runs like that?
It's often on very friendly terms. So, for instance, there's confusingly for us, there's like 3 John Wilsons who are in special branch. One of them is called Jock Wilson, presumably because he's Scottish. Like every Scottish person who turns up in London, or at least did back then, was probably called Jock, weren't they? But so they write this letter, and he gets the letter back from Robert Armstrong, a civil servant. I don't know if that name rings a bell. He was Thatcher's private personal secretary.
Oh right, yes.
And he became very much a neutral civil servant. But he wrote back, "Yes, dear Jock, have the money, Johnny, you know, and nice to speak to you again, probably down the pub or whatever, you know." It's kind of that kind of relationship. One of the things I looked at, I've done in my notes, I've done a word search for anarchists. An anarchist.
Not that we're, you know, like overly focused on our own political movement on this podcast, but correct movement, comrade, correct move. Yeah.
I mean, anarchists within these reports, anarchists are like a bogeyman because, well, it's actually the very first report talks about anarchists being very hard to infiltrate because of our disgusting lifestyles. I think we mentioned that before.
They got this real thing about squats. I mean, they always make squats and like kind of squatters sound like some sort of other species. I think a very deliberate attempt to dehumanise certain people. People being anarchists, they stop being members of the public.
In 1969, they talk about anarchists being characteristically pose problems difficult to solve with the limited facilities, the distasteful nature of the way of life of such people, which officers must assume adds to the difficulties of penetration. In 1970, it said that black power, anarchists, foreign organisations and small, potentially violent groups which adopt a commune squatting existence cannot yet be said to have been mastered by our current techniques. And then, so 1972, we get to the Angry Brigade. And now the Angry Brigade are mentioned just not when it's going on, but throughout.
So just to give some context for those who might not know, I mean, like the Angry Brigade, you stand sort of head and shoulders around what else was happening in the UK in terms of revolutionary, insurrectionary activity, direct actions that were kind of went a bit further than most other things in Britain were doing at the time.
Yeah, I mean, they've done some bombings. They didn't kill anybody. It's probably a summary, isn't it? The whole point is, though, Angry Brigade weren't dealt with by the SDS. They were dealt by the bomb squad. In fact, the bomb squad related to the anti-terror were actually invented because of the Angry Brigade. So, as far as we know, the Angry Brigade had nothing to do with the Special Demonstration Squad. Okay. However, they are used within the annual reports to create this idea of the background of political violence. And similarly, the IRA bombing campaign also, obviously, much more serious and much more, many more people killed. However, the SDS connection with the IRA, zero. Yeah. Okay, but often you find in the introductory paragraphs of the annual reports, and also mentioned in the letters, the begging letters to the Home Office, the IRA are mentioned, even though there's no the SDS aren't doing anything to do with the IRA at all.
Yeah, I think this is something which we saw again, like when the spy cops were first unmasked, and they brought out various, talking heads from the government and police. It was always that, that terrorism, that serious organised crime were brought up as reasons for the requirement of these kind of officers. Yet, as you say, these units had nothing to do with those issues.
This is in the 1972 report. It says, anarchists, their biggest threat is their potential for violent Angry Brigade type action. Nothing of note since the Angry Brigade has happened, but the anarchists are feeling declass due to the provisional IRA bombing campaign. So basically, they're saying that anarchists might start blowing things up because they're jealous of what the IRA are doing, which seems like, again, not really how people are motivated. It's like, when I hear like a bombing going off, my immediate thought is, I wish I did that. It's just ridiculous, really. And there's actually a similar thing, not about anarchists, in an early report, in the 1970 report. It's actually on this Red Europe conference. This is more like a international socialist SWP type conference, and it says, it remains to be seen whether the British contingent will be infected by the more virulent strains of extremism which have been witnessed on the continent. The lack of a real home is, again, this is idea of that we're searching for a cause. The lack of a real home-based casus belli makes the extremists more sensitive to outside influences, the jibes of foreign counterparts for their failure to advance the revolution, the spectacular riots, kidnappings, hijackings and bomb outrages abroad, and the comparative ease with which the police here are handling their demonstrations adds to their frustration. There are signs that the extremists are seeking an outlet in small, isolated acts, such as the recent petrol bomb incidents in London. I'm not sure which ones they're talking about there, 1970. The danger is that being planned and executed by small cliques, advance information or evidence after the event cannot be guaranteed. So again, there's this whole thing is like people, activists based in Britain are going to be jealous of their foreign counterparts because they're blowing up stuff. I mean, it's just ridiculous.
It's a very poor attempt at psychoanalysis, isn't it? Really, it's like this concept of like what motivates people is like keeping up with the neighbours, keeping up with the neighbouring political movements,
and the idea that we're like in search of this unifying cause to unite. I mean, it doesn't really work like that. Sometimes those things happen, like obviously like the anti-Iraq war thing, where lots of different kinds of groups on the left all got together, but it wasn't like we were like waiting for bated breath for the announcement to come, was it? We're trying to stop the war, not for the war to happen. You know, it was the idea is like that's what we want to happen, so we can piggyback our politics.
It's a total reverse reading of the situation, because the reality is the greater the injustice, the more people will be outraged and want to do something about it.
And yeah, so 1976, so this is like 6 years after the Angry Brigade stuff happened. And they're still going on about the Angry Brigade, basically. A little has changed on the front. In the last year, I talk about anarchists against those professing the creed are continuing nuisance in demonstrations from the circles from which they move in. And formation of Angry Brigade type cell violence might happen again. Several individuals are thought to hold such views, again pretty vague, have appeared on political campaigns recently, and SDS coverage of anarchist groups continues.
That goes back to that other thing which is so prevalent in sort of the police sort of consideration of how people operate. It's the idea that, like, are there extremists and they're infiltrating groups, rather than people who are politically aware and might have opinions on things, motivated to campaign on issues that they care about.
And yeah, anarchists also described at one point as sinister, as our big flame for those who were around in the early 70s, mid 70s. Yeah. They were autonomous Marxists, weren't they? But they're described as the sinister big flame organisation, which originated in the northwest but soon spread to London. But again, a few lines down, a number of hitherto underlined revolutionaries from the shop floor of industry, combined with a clique of well-educated individuals, several with Angry Brigade associations. There we go again.
That came up as a thing about, we wore badges that was like free the members of the Angry Brigade were on trial. You know, it's the connections they're talking about are very vague in that kind of sense. But I mean, I think generally we should read if Special Branch said it was sinister, it was probably pretty fucking cool.
But the whole thing about, as we mentioned in '69, we were saying they were anarchists are quite difficult to get a hold on politically. You know, they didn't really know. And then, but the very last report pretty much says the same thing. We still don't really know what's going on 25 years later. But that's kind of in some ways that you might think, that's like a confession of failure, but it actually acts as this whole thing is unknown. It's like bogey, as I was saying, it's bogeyman, because if we don't know what they're doing, we need to investigate. Okay, our investigations aren't working, but so is this it's like a Mobius loop of like justification. It's sort of go round. Yeah, it was in 1981 that anarchists were labelled in the annual report sinister and potentially dangerous. And then finishing on the whole anarchist self-indulgent little bit. But so we get to jump ahead to 1984, and now at this point, 1984, the main infiltrator in anarchist group was Roger Pierce, and he was mainly infiltrating Freedom Press, for Freedom Collective.
Look forward to a future episode on him.
1984, I think he'd been around then 3 years in Freedom, so you would have thought he would have been relatively well read up on anarchism, so we get this really odd. I mean, you're kind of guessing this bit has been written by him and it's been thrown into the report, but it says anarchist rejection of party building, political campaigns and structural organisation will ensure the movement remains small. On one hand,
he's got a point.
He's got a point, but the whole thing about party building is like, well, because we don't do parties, so it's kind of a bit of an odd thing to say. I mean, there is an element of truth to that. So, it's easy to recruit if you have a structured organisation, for sure. But given that,
But I mean, there was also plenty of left-wing parties in the UK which were smaller than the anarchist movement at the time.
In the 80s, like direct action movement were around, and they were much more sort of like more type sort of syndicalist organisations. So they did exist. They use, if you like, the unknown as a justification. As I say, is that it always needs further investigation. You never know.
These narco-punks are so mysterious. Which is also a good recruitment tactic. Being anarchist, kids, is mysterious.
There's a fair few random bits in here. There's one particular thing which kind of stands out. This is in the 1973 report. It says, it's a bit sinister, this, talking of sinister things. It says, the security service, in addition to their usual expressions of admiration for the work of the squad, are currently giving practical assistance in an SDS-inspired operation aimed at obtaining intelligence of redacted name. If the operation is successful, it might alia, I'm not sure how you say it, Latin, isn't it? Yeah. Indicate a potential for a more aggressive approach to intelligence gathering in some controlled circumstances. Now, I'm not really sure what they mean by that. Some kind of coercion to get information out of somebody, or blackmail, or what, torture?
Yeah, it sounds, I mean, like more aggressive does suggest some really bad things.
Within the letters to the Home Office, there are basically two main, if you like, overarching reasons for the squad's existence is, public order, and secondly, subversion, which is MI5's bag. However, I mean, we know from other documents that on many occasions, the SDS were kind of reluctant to help MI5 out on subversive stuff. I mean, basically, they seemed to only do it if it didn't put them out in any way, and if it didn't put any of the undercovers in any form of danger. In the very beginning days, early 70s, there was one or two groups which had, I'd say, tenuous Irish Republican connections, but it was soon decided that was too dangerous. So they pulled them out of there.
On one level, that they're desperate to invoke the most dangerous side of extremism that they can possibly think of. Oh, it's the Angry Brigade. Oh, it's the IRA. Oh, whatever. Whilst at the same time, when it comes to actually being deployed on any of these topics, they're like, oh, Jesus Christ, no, that's for the big boys. That's not for the likes of us.
In the Barry Tompkins episode, right, there was that opportunity for him to go and infiltrate the KGB, wasn't there? Which he,
Episode 9, if you've not listened to it, go check it out.
Well remembered, the episode number, Tom. So yeah, MI5 are generally only mentioned in those general terms about the SDS's sort of providing information regarding subversive individuals and groups. Oh yeah, so going right back to the beginning, the 1969 report, I suppose, in some ways, what they think is a good thing. Where it opens, new entrants to the extreme left-wing political scene are being identified and recorded within weeks of their manifesting an interest in extremist affairs, and obviously lots of.
I mean, that's more chilling than the rest.
It is. It's kind of like all you have to do is turn up at a meeting once, and you'll be like, a person of interest.
And it's certainly something we heard from later undercover officers when they were being asked about the level to which they were aware of activity on their patch. And it was like, well, if somebody bought a copy of The Socialist Worker, I was going finding out where they lived.
Yeah, so it goes on in this paragraph. Personal descriptions, addresses and occupations are obtained working within groups, and this material is submitted personally or passed to officers engaged on normal inquiry work. Oh, great. Yeah. So as soon as you step out of line, your name will be down, so to speak.
I mean, this is what they were collecting, right? It was names and addresses. That's what the majority of the reports we've seen so far are full of.
And within the reports, obviously, when you get to sort of the mid-70s, there's a lot of stuff about anti-fascist and fascist activity. So the first one, if you like, the first major one of these is the Red Lion Square demo on June 15th, 1974. And this is where student Kevin Gately was killed. This is one of the ones where nobody really definitely says the police killed him. It's not like the police. Yeah, there's not many people actually say for sure the police killed him. However,
I mean, it was a result of a head injury.
It was. I mean, in the end, it was a result of the police allowing the National Front to hold this meeting at Conway Hall. The people who were running Conway Hall at that time, who thought it was a great idea on some kind of free speech bullshit.
Freeze peach.
To host a National Front meeting. However, I mean, if you like, the analysis in the report is pretty terrible. Yeah, so it gives a description of how the police saw it happen, which basically everything got blamed on in the newspapers on the IMG, the International Marxist Group, and then in this report they also mention the Communist Party of England, Marxist-Leninist, it gives a description of protesters charging the police lines. But then it sort of finishes. Fortunately, the Special Demonstration Squad gave forewarning of both the size of the demonstration and possible disorder which might occur. So in some ways they're saying that the intel was great. However, someone died. So I would say that was a failure of intelligence. But then the worst bit is, it sort of ends. Gately's death introduced a note of harsh reality, so that subsequent demonstrations, both in the Metropolitan Police District and at Leicester, did not achieve the aims of the militant minorities. It's kind of saying that Gately's death acted as a kind of disciplinary thing to anti-fascists. It's just like, that's pretty sick.
It's just it's seen in cold terms. It's seen in these really cold, cynical policing terms entirely. There's no sort of acknowledgement of the tragedy of any of it.
The Wikipedia entry on that Red Line Square thing needs to be heavily edited. Basically, it says in the entry that the militant and totally justified actions of the International Marxist Group, and I'm sure others, to try and stop the fascists having this meeting, basically caused the National Fronts to get publicity and therefore do relatively well at the elections. So apparently it was like the anti-fascist fault. Going on to 75, so another NF function, this time I think it was their general meetings actually when they had this split, and
the National Party, which ended up being much more effective electorally than the National Front ever were really at the time, despite being much smaller. Yeah, they ended up with a bunch of councillors.
So this is kind of like very much a sort of smug write-up of various groups, including the Anarchist Workers Association and various anti-fascist groups to try and stop the meeting. It says the final attempt by the ultra-left. Now, the ultra-left is the phrase that is used to describe in all these reports in the 70s. It's not really used now, is it?
It's a very, I mean, like these days, anybody who's using the term ultra-left is a proper geek. I mean, it'd be, you'd have to be, pretty deep in like sort of praxis and literature, like theory to use throw around terms like ultra left. But I think we probably most listeners to this podcast series would know what it is in broad terms.
Yeah, it's just a different label to what we're used to more recently, I guess. The final attempt by the ultra left to disrupt a National Front function in 1975 occurred during the latter's extraordinary AGM at Chelsea Old Town Hall on the 11th of October. Smarting from previous failures, again, this is liking out as due to great public order policing, their failures to their wonderful policing, which allowed the NF to march and have meetings everywhere. The ultra-left set up a special ad hoc committee, the West London Campaign Against Racism and Fascism, to coordinate the planning for the counter demonstration. And it goes on to say basically they failed to do that, and hooray, aren't we great, because we let all the Nazis march and have meetings.
You've got to, from their point of view, that we have to remember, the National Front were not a problem. That's a line we've heard again and again, not just in the literature from what they were saying at the time, but also what former officers were saying much more recently when interviewed at the inquiry, that the National Front were not a problem, and the problem was the attempts by the left to disrupt them. That was the political position. So they're just not patting themselves on the back.
Again, yeah, so it's a similar thing. Then again, in the 76 report, annual report, it talks about the potential for violence amongst revolutionary ultra-left groupings remains as strong as ever, but is beginning to reveal itself more in comparatively small local actions against, in particular, the ultra-right, National Front and National Party, when those involved hope to catch the police off their guard. To combat this, the SDS has found it necessary to keep a close watch both on the extremist organisations. Now, you might think that might include the National Front, and the National Party doesn't. When they say that, it doesn't mean them at all. It just means the left. And on local broad front anti-racialist groups through which the revolutionaries operate. Now that so that means they obviously giving them carte blanche to infiltrate all kinds of very moderate anti-racist pressure groups. Still in 1976, and we're talking about the murder in Southall of this Asian guy, Indian guy, of Indian descent, I guess, Gurdip Singh Chagar. Apologies, I forgot mispronouncing his name, but it says here. So the murder of an 18-year-old, and they don't actually say his name for some reason. Obviously, it's not worth actually naming in person. Asian in Southall was followed by a violent demonstration there on the 6th of June. Joint action by community leaders and the police was successful in calming the situation. Whereas Trotskyist, Maoists and anarchists seized the opportunity to meddle in troubled waters. The
idea that, rather than being actually genuinely outraged by the racist murder, it's like that somehow there's this gleeful kind of ness coming from radicals about kind of this opportunity to agitate around something that's bad that's happened.
Yeah, so in Lewisham, we've talked about this perhaps in an earlier episode, where they claim to have knowledge of this house that the SWP were holding on the route of the march, which was stocked full of petrol bombs. And they presented this as some kind of amazing bit of intelligence. But obviously, as we know, that demonstration counter NF is now known historically as the Battle of Lewisham, so obviously not a great success for them there.
The idea that there was like any sort of intelligence that came from the SDS beforehand was going to like avert any sort of public order incident at that event is laughable. You know, that they knew that the NF march was going to go through areas where people were, the NF had like specific policies against the residents. There's this laughable idea that somehow the policing approach was trying to prevent disorder while it's facilitating an event like that. It's just loony. Like, of course they're not. You know, of course they've got a political agenda which they're following.
They say the most offensive analysis actually to the demo in Southall in 1979, where Blair Peach was murdered by the Special Patrol Group. It's almost like I should say it's like a trigger warning, because it's pretty like horrible and like a distortion of what happened. So this is quoting the 1979 report. The culmination of the virulent anti-fascist demonstration was the death of the anti-Nazi League supporter Blair Peach and the subsequent campaign against police. So, you know, so apparently it was our fault that the police murdered him. You know, it's just
really early on that they characterise, you know, justice campaigns for someone who's died as a campaign against police. That from the very beginning, there's no recognition that there's any sort of that anybody who's involved in the Friends of Blair Peach campaign is motivated by anything else other than being against the police. It's not that they're outraged that there's been injustice, that their friend has been murdered by cops.
This isn't like a deceit by the police. This is like their genuine view of what happened, despite the facts. So again, the 1980 report talking about demos which happened, you know, in connection with the justice campaign for Blair Peach. It says the death of Blair Peach, an active supporter of the anti-Nazi League, which was a consequence of a violent anti-fascist demonstration in Southall, provided the extreme left wing, again, because we're always looking for these opportunities, with an opportunity to mount a sustained campaign to discredit and criticise the police. And it's like, I mean, I don't know what to say about that.
They're like discrediting the police by campaigning about the time that the police brutally murdered someone. It's like, maybe the problem's the fact that you brutally murdered someone, you fucking bastards.
Yeah, I mean,
more so than in any other period of the Special Demonstration Squad, I think the anti-fascist, the campaign against anti-fascists in the late 1970s and the facilitation of the far right by the police more generally really exposes like the agenda of this unit and what their role is in British society.
Definitely, yeah. So now we come to like just random bits of analysis. What should I picked out? Because obviously, because we've got all the reports 1969 to 1984. So that's 25 reports. So it's a lot of material there. Some of them are short as like 12 or 13 pages. I mean, but for some reason, the very last one is like 40 pages long. So we're talking about quite a lot of information, quite a lot of dubious statements and things which is that true, or who's that group, and you go off and so you know, there's loads of these obscure groups that, you know, even though I've been doing this for a while now, I still haven't heard of every single one. You have to do a bit of research and find out who's who. And these are sort of like the edited lowlights, I suppose you could say, of them.
If anybody's really interested in this stuff and you want us to do another episode on with more of Chris's highlights and lowlights of the reports, please get in touch.
Yeah, but, you know, if you're
leave us a review.
If you're a fan of the annual reports, you know. But anyway, I've spent quite a lot of time, hours on them. So if you meet me in person, I almost certainly will talk to you about them, whether you want to or not. Anyway,
if you want Chris to come to your local group, or just
if you want to do it, I'm available for PAs. But yeah, so Brixton riots. So this is actually telling this paragraph in a lot of different ways. So it starts off saying, without doubt, the most significant event in the public order field was the rioting which occurred in Brixton between the 10th and the 13th of April 1981. The thing is, and that is the biggest and sort of most significant public order things that happen are always unplanned, they're spontaneous, and they are not organised by any groups.
Almost like they're a direct response to injustice.
Which is pretty obvious to probably, at the time, to everybody in the country except the right-wing tabloid press and the police, it seems. Right. So, because it says here, so one of the amazing bits of information that SDS come up with, it says, so though in the wake of the riots, political extremists made efforts to exploit the situation with a view to the formation of further disorder. Intelligence gleaned by the SDS confirmed that the disturbances were not instigated by known members of subversive organisations. On the contrary, well-placed sources reported that though a number of anarchists did take part in the riots, they were not responsible for the initiation. Well, no shit, Sherlock. I mean, probably, I don't know if anybody at the time really thought that, the relatively small number of anarchists in Brixton specifically and more wider in London had the ability to start a riot like that.
They see the involvement of those people as being like, oh, it's extremists infiltrating. Whereas in reality, these are people who still also live in this area along with everybody else, and perhaps they've got the same. They're motivated by the same objective conditions that exist as the other people who are rioting.
Well, I mean, the commissioner at the time basically blame it on outside agitators, as all these things, all riots are always the work of, because of the whole thing about outside agitators is it makes it sound like the people that are involved in the riot don't really have a just cause. They don't have a grievance. Well, obviously, clearly they did in Brixton. Obviously, for people who didn't know, I'm sure, the hideous racist policing, the swamping of Brixton, and the dozens of totally unjustified arrests, as well as prior to that, of course, the New Cross fire as well was like a major catalyst for all that kicking off. Yeah, so I mean,
and really telling them, it's like it shows the why that this is never challenged. This kind of continues to be the approach that the police have to the current day about all these sort of events. That like they're still blaming outside agitators for things that happen. They're not learning any of the lessons really, which are kind of really self-evident to anybody who's not the cops, it would seem. Because like the right-wing press, which you mentioned, they're completely disingenuous. They don't actually think that. They're just using it as a thing. But you kind of get the impression the police really do think that,
I mean, it's kind of a political dismissal, isn't it? Because you don't want to believe... I mean, the whole thing, blaming on outside agitators was a denial of the racist policing, really, wasn't it? I mean, that's like anybody. There's loads of stuff out there about all that happening. There's the Steve McQueen series about that.
Check out on iPlayer, Small Acts and Uprisings. Yeah, Steve McQueen's work on all that stuff's well worth checking out.
And then 1982. So there's actually two again. This is, sorry everybody who isn't an anarchist, but this is
no apologies, no apologies, never apologise. In order to understand like how kind of crazy that the way that the police reports are, is having that bit of knowledge about those movements in the first place. These things make more sense, and it's no wonder that like we're looking at things from an anarchist perspective rather than a Marxist-Leninist one, because that's not our background.
Yeah, indeed. So, in 1982, so this is a quote from the 82 report, So, on the 1st of April 1982, a joint team of officers from the Special Branch and Anti-Terrorist Squad, CO13, executed search warrants against Freedom Collective of Anarchists, this is their words, and Little A printers in the East End of London, printing plates and several thousand pamphlets dealing with the manufacture of explosive devices, homemade guns, assassination techniques, and booby traps were seized. It was believed the intention was to distribute these pamphlets to a selected area of London in anticipation of a recurrence of the 1981 serious racial disturbances. And it goes on, in the end, the Director of Public Prosecutions decided not to prosecute the 7 anarchists arrested during the search. However, police action had the effect of curbing the distribution of such literature. So basically, they've done this raid, nicked all these leaflets, and then the DPP, the prosecution, said actually there's no grounds to do anything because what they were doing was perfectly legal. So just to go into a bit of detail here, so Little A printers, they were connected with Anarchy Collective and all them lot. Yeah. And they printed a riot, which you can find on Libcom if you want to find it. It's called "We Want to Riot, Not to Work: The 1981 Brixton Uprisings," and basically it's just like an account and I suppose a celebration of the Brixton riots. The other pamphlet, which was being, I would say, slightly mysteriously being printed by at Freedom. Maybe it was actually being done by Aldgate Press, which is their commercial arm, isn't it? Yeah. Now this is the funny thing, because as far as I know, in Freedom Collective around this time, most people involved were of a pacifist orientation.
Yeah, that's fair.
But they were printing. I spoke to somebody who was around at the time, and they were basically had been ordered to print this sort of leaflet. It's kind of like the Anarchist Cookbook, but it was it's really weird that they were printing it, because it was basically this a pamphlet written by this right-wing militia guy in the States about how to defend yourself against the state.
Remember, a few years earlier, you'd had like Towards the Citizens Militia, public alternatives to NATO and the Warsaw Pact, which was an anarchist publication. Right. So I mean, there was like kind of, there was like almost like an academic, like kind of, having these sorts of things that were a thing. They were around at the time, they used to turn up.
But given the fact that, as I say, so maybe I'm adding 2 and 2 up and making 5 here, but given the sort of pacifist orientation of freedom at that time, it seems a weird thing for them to be printing. Yeah. But also, at that point, Roger Pierce was infiltrating freedom.
Right, okay, that's interesting, isn't it?
So, that makes me a bit suspicious about how they ended up being told they were printing this leaflet.
So was this something that was being like published by this right-wing American, or was it extracts of his appearing in some other publication?
Well, we don't know who ordered it to be printed. Right. It wouldn't have been at the instigation of anybody involved in freedom at the time, I don't think. Right. And what I've been told, it was like a repackaging of this right-wing militia guy, but with like an anarchist cover.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I'm just thinking about, like there's a whole bunch of like insurrectionary sort of primitivist kind of stuff that does exactly that, like 20, 30 years later, that just springs to mind.
I mean, maybe it was genuinely that someone thought that was a good idea to print. Yeah, but it just seemed coincidental.
Yeah,
to
totally.
Me.
Yeah.
I mean, it might be, and I don't want to invent a conspiracy theory.
But I mean, like you say, that the majority of these documents are not being read by anybody of any sort of height within the funding streams or whatever. It's not like these are going outside of the police. This is all sort of internal police reports.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the other things is that the format barely changed from like 1969 till the latest one we have. It's pretty much the same. So you got the introduction, and you got the list of the name of groups that were infiltrated, and then you got this is what they did this year, this is what we think they're going to do next year. Because of these things, we want to carry on, and we're totally justified by providing information that can't be. This is one of the other things which is said quite often, like the information we're collecting cannot be gained any other way. And you're talking on those sort of twisty turny ways they justify themselves, because they, often, what you mentioned, they often say that anarchists aren't doing very much at the moment, but they might do. Similarly, we've got, going back to 1976, we've got such schisms and smaller groupings of political groups are, of course, the advantage of police, whose manpower would be severely stretched should the ultra-left sink their differences and unite for joint demonstrations. However, and this is the clever bit, this advantage, however, is to some way outweighed by the need for greater SDS coverage of the smaller groups, you see, because there's all these divisions, actually makes it more, we need the SDS despite the threat being diluted by all the little groups. Do some quite good sort of contortions in there. Again, also similarly on the similar lines of, if you like, the using sort of the anarchist / violent threat as a sort of reason for, and the IRA using sort of background of violence, which has nothing to do with the SDS. Or they mentioned this one campaign group which was like campaign against repression in West Germany and blockade. So basically these two very small groups, they, I suppose, done prisoner support to people arrested in Germany, including members of the Red Army faction. Now, just to make it a sort of clear division, these people were not a support group for the Red Army faction. They merely sort of like basically doing like prisoner support for them, as we're saying. But this is kind of used, the fact that they're sort of concerned about the way they're being treated in Germany as the connection. So yeah, it says blockade organisation which came to prominence in the latter half of the year and are both supporters of the West German Baader-Meinhof group, which has received its major support in this country from anarchist groups, which is total bullshit, because obviously Red Army faction, Marxist-Leninist, and nothing, not a strong connection with the anarchist sort of philosophy at all. So
but they were sinister and they looked a bit cool. So from the SDS point of view, it's like, oh yeah, they're all the same sort of thing. They're a bit, it's the sinister ones.
And talking about, again, another example of lazy writing. So we come to the Grunwick dispute. So it says, it's it's obviously
So Grumwick's this enormous dispute. If you don't, we'll put a link in the show notes.
iconic. They had there's an anniversary website out there. It began in August 1976 when 80 predominantly Asian employees of the Grunwick film processing labs were dismissed after stopping work. And it says that the strike happened because they're in support of higher pay and better working conditions. This is what it says in the report. That's not true. They went on strike because they wouldn't recognise a union. Pretty basic, isn't it?
Really basic. I mean, the time and again, like the cops get these really basic things wrong. It's like you just get it doesn't matter really to them. Like none of the actual detail that matters is.
And it says carries on the analysis of this bit. Supported and organised by Apex, Association of Professional Executive Clerical and Computer Staff Union, and various other trade councils. The Grunwick factory was peacefully picketed until June 1977. Following a poorly attended demo in April 77, the dispute was taken up by the ultra-left, and throughout June, July and August of that year, Trotskyist-inspired violence escalated in the streets surrounding by the Grunwick factory, and especially at the two entrances where mobs inspired by the ultra-left attempted to prevent the employees, coaches, not employees, scabs, from entering the factory. So, again, really weird analysis. Jumping around a bit here, but just picking out, as I say, the lowlights. So, since the SDS was formed in 1968 to deal with a particular problem of violent anti-American demonstrations, it wasn't really anti-American, was it?
Anti-war, anti-Vietnam War was the Americans were the aggressors in. I mean, it's a really big stretch, that.
Yeah, it's broad air of responsibility, the penetration of extremist groups to the left of the Communist Party.
What does that even mean?
You can't really be to the left of the Communist Party. Well, I guess what they're getting at is the Communist Party of Great Britain was quite supine in its attitudes to like demonstrations and also organising compared to, if you like, the new left in inverted commas, Trotskyists and like the International Marxist Group, International Socialists, and I guess to a small degree anarchist groups. That's what they mean by that. They don't mean to the left. They mean more Raji.
The more left wing you are, is just about the more like the more aggressive, the more confrontational, which is like, it doesn't really matter about the politics.
Paragraph reiterates that whole thing about the names of the target organisations may have altered, but their aims have not, nor has their propensity for seizing on any topical issue, from tenants' disputes to industrial strikes, which they feel can translate to their own advantage. Again, can't be a genuine concern for the issue. Oh no.
They never acknowledge, this particular thing was born of a genuine injustice. This just doesn't exist in their world. It's one of those ones, how much of this is to dive into the mind of the cops and the cop culture, or is it like, is this just a completely disingenuous document that's just like scrabbling around for, justifications?
Sometimes I think they do seem to be like, oh God, what are we going to say now? But I think some of it is they genuinely believe it to the extent this is the way it helps them justify to themselves on a maybe personal level what they're doing.
Right.
I mean, because obviously if you start like, getting all self-reflexive and like doubting yourself, then
where's that
where's that going to get you? You're not going to get you promoted, is it?
No, it's not going to.
And there's similar things again. Internment in the north of Ireland. Yeah. That is apparently again. The left is described as the left have found a new cause celeb.
It's not that the British government has stepped outside the real basics of habeas corpus and the rule of law to such an extent that like there's outrage across Britain. No, it's not that. It's that the left have found some sort of special way of discrediting. Like overall, like your overwhelming impressions after reading that, you're like, well, of course they're going to keep going and growing, which is what they actually did do.
It seems like the memos and that are so short to the Home Office. They seem to be quite confident they were going to get it. Actually, because I mentioned earlier about in 1983, Robert Armstrong sort of writes and say, actually, do you mind telling us what you've been up to for the last 24 years? Because we've not really heard much from you besides this begging letter for some more cash. And actually, in the penultimate report that we have. The report format changes, and we actually have like a profile of the undercovers within the annual report. Okay. I think it's like 1983, and it's for instance, Bob Lambert's in it, and he is described as just turned up in the squad, and he's doing clerical work, waiting to be sent out to the field. And I kind of thought, oh, maybe that report has gone to the Home Office because in response to this request. But actually, that's probably me sort of putting these two things together. But it actually says in the memo, maybe we can just have a chat about it. So what I do, I don't think actually this report did go to the Home. Is what happened. Probably the Assistant Chief Constable and maybe somebody from the SDS just had a bit of a chat down at the club, down at the Garrick or whatever. Yeah,
It's like that's the briefing document for the person who speaks to the.
Yeah. A few little bits and pieces of what the other things which are in the reports, which I haven't mentioned, is they have sort of accounts in them, and they're not all that interesting. The costs of running the cars, for instance, the cost of the officers' accommodation, and going back to the cars. Initially, they basically used the police carpool and they had 2 or 3 cars, and then in the early 70s they started buying second-hand cars, and they actually have in the accounts they have a list of all the cars and against the officers' names and the reg plates, except weirdly, and I find it's really hard to understand why they bothered redacting this, but they redacted all the reg plates and all the officers' names against the cars. Now this is like reg plates circa 1974, so it seems very hard to believe that particular bit of information is going to be of use to anybody, unless perhaps some activists out there who around in like 1975 have a photographic memory and they memorised all their comrades' number plates. It just seems a bit. I just don't understand how that bit of information could possibly be needed to be redacted. It just seems ridiculous, but it's also like illustrative of how much they have redacted.
Yeah, very much. It's a code system, isn't it? And like from their point of view, everything's a code system, and like unlocking part of that for us would be that would be too scary to them.
Yeah, as I was saying, within these reports have these lists of all the groups they've infiltrated, and also quite a few are redacted. Sometimes whole chunks, and we don't know. Sometimes you can kind of guess which. Sometimes I think it's like they've put a whole chunk out which have been infiltrated by one officer whose cover name's been withheld, perhaps. So that's why they've done it. Other times it just seems a bit. You can't really figure out which ones. And obviously some of the ones where, I suppose we can get into the 80s when they did infiltrate 1 or 2 far-right groups. I guess they're ones that have been have had bits redacted. I guess the National Front, Combat 18, maybe. I think we think they probably infiltrated.
In terms of final impressions on these reports, how much do we learn from them in real terms?
I think I suppose a couple of things. First of all, gives an insight into their mindset. Although to some extent, I kind of agree with you. Sometimes they're sort of floundering around for examples, but also obviously there's stuff about, for instance, their interpretation of the death of Blair Peach and Brixton riots really does give you an insight into the group think that was going on within the police at that time. So they are of interest generally. I think it does give a real good insight. One of the other things which I haven't mentioned, I sort of glossed over it a little bit, is the role of the civil servants in this. The civil servants in the Home Office who sort of received these letters from the senior coppers at the Met and then wrote back saying, yes, here you go, you can have the funds. So there's loads of names. I mentioned Robert Armstrong, David Hillary is another one. Partridge is another one, not Alan, unfortunately. But these guys, I suppose, we've sort of made notes of them and created sort of little files for them ourselves. I guess I hadn't really given them too much thought, them just being these Home Office sort of like yes minister types. But however, it reminded me that within the Home Office they were sort of split up into sections. One of the section which covered the police was called F4. However, that section also included MI5. So the civil servants who were writing these letters back and forth, these people see absolutely everything. They see all the material from MI5. They see all the material from Special Branch. But not only that, they sit on all these other committees, like the Subversion at Home Committee, which led to the blacklisting. And it reminded me of an article I wrote on the Subversion for Home Committee. And also, it was also my colleague Evelyn. She found this PhD written on the Subversion for Home committee, and also other stuff around the miners' strike in terms of like Thatcher's sort of like politicisation of the civil service during that time. Maybe these civil servants are more important than we first think, because, as I say, everything goes across their desk, so they really see the whole picture, and it also, I suppose, leads us to think how much the stuff that we don't get to see. So, for instance, we don't get to hear or see the meetings or the conversations that the senior civil servants had with the Home Secretary. So they would have been able to brief him not only on the intelligence that MI5 got, but also the intelligence that the Special Branch were providing, and also on these various committees. And the other thing that also struck me reading this guy's PhD on the miners' strike was that he does mention the SDS and the Spy Cop scandal a little bit. It's definitely not his focus though, but a lot of the time he's talking about MI5 and the intelligence they're providing. But it also occurs to me that a lot of the time MI5's intelligence in inverted commas is certainly some of that is actually coming via the SDS, via the Special Demonstrations Squad, and it's kind of like been washed, because for sure most of the time ministers aren't going to be told about individual deployments of the SDS, and certainly not ministers from other departments for sure. So yeah,
it is interesting how much the connections with the MI5 have been much greater and deeper than I ever thought they were going to be. It really seems that the SDS are like kind of a cheap sort of outsourcing body almost for the MI5 in one way.
Yeah, there's a committee called the Joint Intelligence Committee, but often in some archives are public on this, and often you see a MI5 represented, but you don't see special ones. You might see a chief constable or the commissioner or assistant commissioner, but often but now you're thinking, from what we know now, from what the SDS's provision of intelligence to MI5 is, when MI5 are talking about stuff that they know about, it's actually, some of it, as I was saying, is actually coming via Special Branch. That's kind of more of a historical point, I guess.
Anything else you want to add on the annual reports?
Yeah, there's a lot of them.
Well, thanks for doing all the reading so that we didn't have to. When we get to the next round, we'll do a part 2 of this series with the next sort of set of years. But that was the first of them anyway. If anybody's got any questions on it, please get in touch. You can find all our previous episodes at spycops.info. Please give us a review on whatever platform you use. If you'd like some stickers to advertise the series, you can find links to that at our website as well.